3 years ago today, Boris Johnson came on our TV screens and he told us this.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. And therefore, I urge you, at this moment of national emergency, to stay at home, protect our NHS, and save lives.
Well, it was actually a 6-minute video, and I have to say it still brings chills to my bone when I hear it. But I want to hear what your reaction is today. What are your thoughts today? How do you feel about that moment, the 3 years since? I'd love you to get in touch. Tweet me at TalkTV. Text the word TALK to 87222. And, of course, that anniversary comes just the day after we had Boris Johnson being hauled before the Privileges Committee in the House of Commons to have 7 MPs, 4 Tories on his own side, apparently, questioning him about whether he lied to Parliament or not about those lockdown-breaking parties. And so many people I hear from say, what does it matter? It was 3 years ago. The first party people are talking about was in May 2020. Does it matter if they stood around and had cake or a bottle of wine? Well, yes. Yes, it does. And I'm going to explain to you why it does matter. It matters that politicians, and especially prime ministers, are honest with us and are accountable to us, and that they know that if they lie to us in Parliament, they will face punishment. It matters that prime ministers who impose laws upon the rest of us don't think that they and their staff are above the law, and especially when they impose the most extreme and illiberal, damaging laws ever seen in this country in peacetime. And it matters because millions of us are still living today and for decades to come with the decisions made by Boris Johnson's government to prevent everyone else from seeing their work colleagues or having a drink with them or seeing their friends, seeing their families, going to school, going to work, travelling, meeting their newborn grandchildren, holding the hand of a loved one as they died, visiting elderly relatives in a care home or going to a funeral. It matters because the people who were breaking the laws that they had helped contrive and make and enforce on everybody else, with penalties from the police turning up and fining you £10,000, they broke those rules behind the door of number 10. Not in fear for their own lives. They didn't think, oh, we're breaking these laws, but we might die as a result or be hospitalised with COVID. No, they knew they weren't at risk. They knew they didn't need to obey those laws, but they still imposed them on everyone else. For a Prime Minister to claim, as he did yesterday, that it was essential that he attended leaving parties for his staff to keep up their morale, when apparently he didn't regard it as essential for children to go to school, for people to visit their families in care homes or attend funerals, shows the abject and grotesque absurdity of the COVID rules that we suffered under. 3 years on, the country is still reeling from the decisions Boris Johnson and his staff made. The economy destroyed. The NHS waiting list at record highs. People dying because of that. Our children's education ruined. The country's mental and physical health damaged for decades. So no, this isn't just about cake or a few bottles of wine at a leaving party. It's not even about Boris's lies about what he did and what he didn't know when. It's about us. It's about all of us, the millions and millions of people who had that those horrible laws imposed on us for all that time. And it's about stopping it from ever happening to us again. Let's talk to Carl Heneghan, Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford, who joins us. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
I have to say, I watched the full 6 and a bit minutes video of that, which went out on our TV screens and radios 3 years ago today. And I have to say, I had chills. I felt angry. I almost wanted to cry. It still comes out, and especially that happening, the day after Boris Johnson giving evidence about parties going on just a few months later in May 2020 in number 10. What are your thoughts today?
Well, it's interesting. I read that and actually did the same, Julie. And there's a statement in there where it says, we will beat the coronavirus and we will beat it together. Well, actually, if it had changed the word beat to catch, it would have made much more sense. We will catch the coronavirus and we will catch it together, and then we'd have had a sensible plan. But I think the key point here is it is 3 years. It's one of them landmark points in our lives where you think, I can remember what I was doing. But hasn't 3 years gone so quickly? And this is the key. In my lifetime, I do not want to be locked down again. I want to maintain the quality of my life. I want to have choices, just like they did in Sweden. If the risk is high, I'll make changes. But actually, we want to go about our business. Life is short. It's about the quality of our life. And so it's key to us that actually going forward, we now have an inquiry that sets out laws that prevents a few people having serious control over our lives.
And that is crucial, isn't it? Because a lot of people will say, like, well, it doesn't matter that Boris Johnson and his team had cake or did not eat cake, did or did not have drinks, did or did not think the rules were against, being broken or not. And people are saying it's 3 years on. But of course, and you say, it hasn't gone quickly. Weirdly, those 3 years and all of those periods of lockdown, it felt to me that they both at the same time dragged forever and felt like a lifetime and flashed by. And you think that was 3 years ago now. We are going to be living with the consequences of all those decisions that were made for many, many, not just years, but decades to come in terms of the impact on our economy, our long-term health. We're seeing decisions about pension age, state pension age being delayed because our longevity, we've actually, we've reduced the average age at which people die in this country as a result of the pandemic. And not just because of COVID, but because of the policies imposed on COVID. The thing I find frustrating is that people say, it's all over, it's done, doesn't matter. But of course, your concern is, and my concern is that this will happen to us again. Lockdown is now seen as a normal part of the toolkit for dealing with a crisis. When we point to the facts and figures, the evidence, and countries like Sweden, people seem to say, no, that doesn't help, that's no use to us. Why do you think that the example of what Sweden did does matter and we should pay attention to it?
Well, number one, it really matters. In the absence of Sweden, every single politician in the world would have stood up now and been saying, we got it right, based on modelling, largely modelling. But I also say to those people who think, well, it doesn't matter, it's all in the past. I was at a school yesterday doing a talk, and the teacher said to me, the children coming to A-levels actually didn't sit their GCSEs. They had 2 years out, and they're really struggling. I met a parent who said my 3-year-old spent the first 2 years of their life thinking that, looking at everybody as though the world wore masks. Yeah. You think of that in the formative years, and you say about the economy. Imagine if we said today we had 370 billion to spend. What we could do with that, how we could improve society. We could have amazing things happen in this country. Yet we blew it all, and a lot of people did very well, and what we created is this big bubble, problems in the supply chain, and now we're facing the consequences, and this could be for a decade to come.
And that's that's the crucial thing. We are living with the impact of that. What about the people who say, look, it's all very well with hindsight, but we didn't, I've heard so many people say, we didn't know it was mostly elderly people who were dying. 93% of people who died were in their 70s plus. Most of those were 80s, 90s years old. I'm not saying those lives don't matter, but let's get things in perspective. We didn't know that. We did. But also that if we hadn't locked down, 3 weeks to flatten the curve, we were told, 3 years to flatten the country. But if we didn't lock down, hundreds of thousands of people could have died, and it was the right thing to do at the time. What do you say to that?
Well, hindsight, I think in September 2020, we had a big chance to change the course of what happened. Alison Pearson interviewed Anders Tegnell in The Telegraph today and said about the meeting in September 20, where it was him, me and Senechigupta talking.
Can I say Anders Tegnell was the man who was in charge of the Swedish policy?
Yes, correct. And there was an option to change course at that time, and that's where there was a complete divergence. We can all accept in the first wave there were issues. Second is we came out of everything. Once we rolled something out, gosh, were we bad at rolling it back. It was too long and occurred for too long a period in time. And it took us almost to the end of 2021 to 22 to wake up, didn't it, to the reality. And that 18 months, as you say, has disappeared, and it did drag on. But in that period, there were many people who were harmed. And indeed, I say this, if you'd set out to try and infect care homes, spread it around hospitals and make sure everybody got this coronavirus, you actually couldn't have done a better job about it, because everybody who's been out and about has had it once. Most people I know have had it twice. And so whatever you tried failed. And you have to accept that. Lockdowns did not work because, as you sit here, find me somebody who didn't have the virus. And
okay,
actually, I'll tell you,
there'll be people shouting at the TV and radio right now saying, yeah, but people getting COVID much later when they'd already had a vaccination, they'd had their first jab or their second jab or their booster, it had changed to Omicron, that they had a much better chance of survival, certainly if they were elderly or obese, than they would have had catching it in March, April 2020.
Yes, so what you're telling me is that, well, in care homes, that wasn't the case. We managed to seed it in care homes right up front, huge wave in the first, and about 30 to 40% of all deaths occurred in care homes. Second, in hospitals, 40% of those people who got it in hospital, who were diagnosed with COVID. So we managed to seed it in all the wrong place. Yes, many people did wait, but lots of those people who got the vaccine were young people who didn't need to have the vaccine, could have got the infection up front and actually protected many of the elderly and vulnerable. We did it the wrong way round. We didn't understand that we really needed to protect those over the age of 75 and understand how to try and do that. It's difficult, but how do you keep it out of care homes? How do you keep it out of hospitals? And how do you protect the most vulnerable?
Yeah.
Well, actually, most of it is you take that free 70 billion and you start to put it into that age group and say...
That would have saved far more lives. And this thing is amazing how many people say to me, oh, how could we possibly have protected all the elderly? But they seem to think that it was okay to lock down children and young people and perfectly healthy people for all that time. Anyway, you said, you mentioned at the very beginning, your concern is that this could happen again. There was a reason why lockdown was never part of WHO or UK pandemic planning. Sweden followed basically the plan that we originally had. And in fact, what Patrick Whitty and Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance were talking about up until mid-March, they were saying, we're not going to lock down, and here's why. It was not ever discussed by SAGE because it was such an absurd and crazy thing to do. It's now, as I say, seems to be an established tool in government's handbooks, you know, for how to deal with the crisis. How concerned are you that this is going to happen again in our lifetimes?
Well, I think we live in a society where there's a heightened fear and anxiety. So we, as a populace, are in that position that anything that comes at us now drives into our fear. And in so, what you see now is you've got the bird flu around the corner. Yep. There's also a lot of commercial interest here. People do incredibly well in this situation. It's not just the drugs and vaccines, it's all of the PPE. Think of all those test sites and all the money that goes into that. So actually, all the pressures are in a direction to say, let's have another pandemic. But you're right to say this lockdown has to come off the table. Because if it hadn't have happened in China, it would have never happened anywhere else in the world. And it didn't work in China because it took over 3 years for them to emerge. And you can't believe a single word that comes out of that country.
Absolutely. Carl Heneghan, you have been just such a wonderful voice of reason and sanity throughout these last 3 years. And I know my audience feel exactly the same way. Thank you very much for joining us.